The United States is becoming increasingly active in Africa. From military deployments to infrastructure projects, the US is making its presence felt. But what exactly is the US up to? Is it genuine partnership or something else? Many are starting to ask these questions. They see a pattern of powerful nations seeking to exploit Africa for their own gain. This time it feels different. There's a new global reality. China is a major player in Africa. They're investing heavily in infrastructure and development. This competition between the US and China adds another layer of complexity. It's not just about resources anymore, it's about influence and geopolitical dominance. African nations are caught in the middle. They need partners to help them develop, but they also want to maintain their sovereignty and independence. It's a delicate balancing act. The US needs to understand this. They need to engage with African nations as equal partners, not just pawns in a larger game. The US needs to be more transparent about its intentions in Africa. They need to listen to the concerns of African people, and they need to work collaboratively to address the challenges facing the continent. Anything less will only fuel suspicion and mistrust. It's time for a new approach, one based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. Africa is rich in resources. It has vast reserves of oil, gas, minerals, and arable land. These resources are essential for economic development, but they can also be a source of conflict and instability. The US has a long history of involvement in resource-rich countries. Often this involvement has been driven by self-interest rather than altruism. The Lobito Corridor project is a case in point. This ambitious infrastructure project aims to connect Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia by rail. The project has the potential to boost trade and economic growth in the region. However, critics argue that the project is primarily about extracting resources for Western markets. They point to the fact that the project is being financed by Western companies and institutions. The US argues that the Lobito Corridor is a development project. They say it will create jobs and improve infrastructure. But many Africans remain skeptical. They have seen this story before. They fear that the project will benefit foreign companies more than local communities. They worry about environmental damage and displacement. Transparency is crucial. The US needs to be upfront about its interests in the Lobito Corridor and other resource-related projects. They need to ensure that these projects benefit local communities and that environmental protections are in place. Otherwise, they risk repeating the mistakes of the past. The US military presence in Africa has been growing steadily in recent years. The US has established military bases and conducted operations in several African countries. The stated goal of this presence is to counter terrorism, promote stability, and support humanitarian efforts. However, some critics argue that the US military presence is actually about securing strategic interests and countering Chinese influence. The US often justifies its military interventions on humanitarian grounds. They point to the need to protect civilians from violence and instability. However, these interventions are often controversial. Critics argue that they often exacerbate conflicts and lead to civilian casualties. They also point out that the US has a history of supporting authoritarian regimes in Africa when it suits its interests. The lack of transparency surrounding US military operations in Africa is concerning. The US government rarely provides detailed information about its activities, citing national security concerns. This lack of transparency makes it difficult to assess the true nature and impact of US military involvement. It also fuels suspicion and mistrust among African populations. The US needs to be more transparent about its military activities in Africa. They need to engage in meaningful dialogue with African governments and civil society organizations, and they need to ensure that their military interventions are in line with international law and human rights standards. The world is becoming increasingly multipolar. The US is no longer the sole superpower. China is emerging as a major economic and geopolitical force. This new reality has significant implications for Africa. African nations are now courted by multiple global powers, each with its own agenda. This presents both opportunities and challenges. China's approach to Africa differs from that of the US. China focuses on infrastructure development and trade. They have invested heavily in roads, railways, ports, and other infrastructure projects across Africa. This has earned China goodwill in many African countries. However, some critics accuse China of engaging in debt-trap diplomacy, saddling African countries with unsustainable debt. The US needs to adapt to this new reality. They cannot afford to ignore China's growing influence in Africa. Instead, they should focus on building genuine partnerships with African nations based on mutual respect and shared interests. They should prioritize sustainable development, good governance, and human rights. The US should avoid trying to force African nations to choose sides between the US and China. Such an approach would be counterproductive and would only serve to alienate potential partners. Instead, the US should focus on building its own credibility and trust in Africa, demonstrating that it is a reliable and trustworthy partner.